Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Keep It Clean 2026 Product Advisory Webinar. Thank you for joining us. I'm Heidi Danshaw, the Director of Communications at the Canola Council of Canada here in Winnipeg, and I'll be moderating today's session. As an export-driven industry, Canadian agriculture depends on stable, predictable access to key international markets, and crop protection product decisions play an important role in that, which is why we're here today. The Keep It Clean Product Advisory is an excellent tool to guide growers, agronomists, and agri-retailers, and we hope you'll find today's session valuable. Before we begin, I'll quickly review how to participate in the webinar. So on your screen, you'll see a Q&A tab along the bottom. Please use that to submit any of your questions at any time during the webinar. We'll leave some time for questions at the end, but encourage you to send them in as they come up. If you experience any technical issues during the webinar, please also let us know through that Q&A tab as well. And if we don't get to your question during the webinar, we'll follow up by email, and you can also feel free to reach out to us at any time at info@keepitclean.ca. One final note before we begin, today's webinar is being recorded. A recording will be emailed out to all the participants, and it'll also be posted on our website at keepitclean.ca. So we have a lot to cover this morning, so we'll get started. Next slide, please. So today we're joined by three speakers who will share timely information on which crop protection products may create market risk in 2026 and how the Canadian grain industry is working together to mitigate these risks. I'm pleased to welcome Krista Zuzak, Director of Crop Protection and Production for Cereals Canada, Jeff English, Vice President of Public Affairs at Pulse Canada, and Curtis Rempel, Vice President of Innovation, Production, and Supply at the Canola Council of Canada. Next slide, please. So to give you a quick overview of today's agenda, we're going to start with a review of MRLs and the global trade landscape, the Keep It Clean program, and the steps used to determine market risk. We'll then move on to the product advisory for cereals and pulses, followed by some additional Keep It Clean tips on following the label, disease management, proper storage, and delivery declarations. And we'll close with some time for Q&A. Next slide, please. Now I'll turn it over to Krista to start us off with an overview of why these practices matter. Over to you, Krista.
Thanks, Heidi. When we think of why we have a program like Keep It Clean that we're going to talk about today, it really starts with the nature of our grain markets. In Canada, we produce more grain than we need domestically, so we do have a large volume for export. More than 90% of canola, 85% of pulses, and 80% of cereals are exported. However, this also comes with complexities of exporting into so many markets. Next slide, please. Because of our large export potential, Canadian grains need to not only meet Canadian requirements, but also the requirements of our export customers, and these are not always perfectly aligned. They may differ based on the products registered in an importing country as far as pesticides go, and each country also has their own pest list, so there are considerations for things like weed seeds in terms of sanitary and phytosanitary requirements. To add to this, these requirements can change on a short timeline as policies and regulations evolve. There are also reasons less rooted in science, so commercial pressures towards pesticide-free grain or looking for no residues at all, as well as policies in some markets that are more hazard-based than science-based, like we have here in Canada. And finally, we have to consider testing. So testing of grain is getting more frequent in markets and more sensitive on the science side for testing and having those detections. Next slide, please. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today is in regards to MRLs, or maximum residue limits. In case you are not familiar with these, an MRL is the highest amount of pesticide residue that is expected to remain on a food, like a grain, when a pesticide is applied according to label directions. So MRLs are legal and enforceable limits based on how growers use pesticides. It's important to note, though, that MRLs are not a measure of food safety. as the food safety side is assessed for a pesticide prior to setting that MRL. Think of MRLs really being there for trade purposes. And, one of the ways that we avoid trade disruptions are having these compatible MRLs between Canada and other countries. Next slide, please. So each country does have the ability to set MRLs for pesticide residues. Some set their own national list, like we do here in Canada or in the United States. However, others may choose to use MRL set by Codex, which is an international standard setting body. So for those countries that defer to Codex MRLs, they can then leverage the risk assessments and the analysis that are done by Codex and partners, and then they don't have to complete their own set of risk assessments. And then to further complicate, past these national lists that we're talking about in Codex, there can also be deferral pathways in some markets. So as an example, Paraguay, they set a national MRL as part of their list, and then in the absence of a national MRL, they would defer to Codex. However, if they don't have a national MRL and there is no Codex MRL, they would then defer to the European Union's MRL. And finally, one more part to mention about MRLs would be that some countries also have a default MRL. So like in Canada, for example, if no MRL is set, it is automatically set at 0.1 parts per million. So also something very small. And default MRLs can also differ. So for example, in the European Union, their default MRL is even 10 times lower than in Canada. So they set theirs at 0.01 parts per million. Next slide, please. So just like MRLs can change over time, so can our export markets. So we have geopolitical circumstances like we are seeing today that can influence markets as well as some other factors. So market diversification has obviously been really big in the news in the last few years, but that also comes with some considerations for requirements in these markets that we may be expanding into. So for each commodity, including canola, cereals, and pulses, market requirements are reviewed along with changes in the markets themselves. And again, we think about, how big some of these changes could be, because when we're looking at cereals, for example, we're looking at wheat, at durum, at barley, and oats. And then in pulses, we're looking at lentils, at peas, and chickpeas. So it's really a lot of crops and market combinations to be considering. Next slide, please. So one market that is viewed as a standard setter, due to not only, as I mentioned, some countries deferring to their MRLs and also their policies, is the European Union. So on the sanitary and phytosanitary side of things, for example, the EU submitted an increasing number of new or modified SPS measures year over year from 2023 to 2024 to 2025. China, the United States, and Chile were the most active commenters on the EU legislation. So last year alone, the EU received 35 written comments and faced several specific trade concerns raised at the SPS committee. Next slide, please. So as for the policy direction overall in the EU, this is something that our commodity organizations have been closely watching, especially the proposal on the food and feed safety simplification omnibus. So we've seen broadly that the European Commission has published this vision for agriculture and food, and this is kind of a follow-up to some of the farm to fork that we've seen previously. So when we dig specifically into some of these proposals and changes like the omnibus, it includes language around reciprocity and banning the import of products into the EU, like grains, that are treated with pesticides that aren't approved in the EU. So this definitely raises concerns for our organizations as well as for farmers here in Canada, where these pesticides are assessed for safety and registered for use here in Canada. So it could mean market access issues in the future if treated grain was deemed unacceptable by the EU. And maybe just to give you an idea about the magnitude of some of these changes we've seen over time out of the EU, since 2022, Cereals Canada has tracked 185 EU MRL changes, with 70 of those actives being registered on at least one cereal crop in Canada. Next slide, please. So what do we do about all of this as an industry? In the short term, we use programs like Keep It Clean through the process that Jeff is going to outline next, and we communicate them through webinars like this and other communication tools. In the more medium term, we do work with life science companies, for example, to resolve issues. So this might mean applying for additional MRLs to fill in some of those gaps. And then on a more long-term basis, we advocate for regulatory cooperation and harmonization or having alignment through some of those MRLs, whether this is across commodities if multiple are impacted, or across countries where this could work. And we also rely on work with our government partners and other broader industry organizations on the regulatory side of things. Next slide, please. So one of the ways to think about this short-term risk mitigation that we're talking to you about today is thinking about your grain and how it moves. So with so many channels from your farm to the port, we really need to keep in mind that grain is tested for residues now more than ever and at many stages. So really assume that grain will be tested several times along the supply chain for compliance with those residues. Next slide, please. So now that you have a solid understanding of MRLs and some of the risks, I also want you to keep in mind that MRLs are not something that are on product or pesticide labels. So later in our webinar, Curtis is going to talk about some of the practices on farm that can help keep residues predictable and help keep us in line with MRLs. But this is also a good reminder to connect with your national commodity organization for your crops, like the folks on this webinar, but also connect with your grain buyer. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to Jeff with Pulse Canada to talk about the Keep It Clean program.
Well, thanks, Krista, and thanks to everybody for taking the time to join this webinar here this morning. The Keep It Clean program, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a joint initiative between Pulse Canada, Cereals Canada, Canola Council of Canada, and the Prairie Oat Growers Association. And ultimately, it's driven at providing information. That's information back through the value chain to the farm gate that is timely and that helps inform decisions being made on farm. And the end goal of that is to ensure that the crop that's going into the ground and the way that it's being grown is going to be acceptable to the end use markets that we rely on as a country. Krista touched on exports and the importance of exports to our industry. And this program is designed to ensure that growers and those who advise them have access to the information they need to ensure that how the crop is being grown and handled is going to provide the return at the end of the day that they're looking for when that product hits the export market. We also partner very closely with the Government of Canada in terms of helping with awareness and funding under the Sustainable Canadian Agricultural Partnership. And so they've been an important mechanism for us to help leverage the dollars that go into this fund and ensure that we have access to the communications tools that we need in order to help communicate that information back through the value chain. Next slide, please. If you're familiar at all with the program, a lot of this won't seem new to you, but it is about communicating risk. And one of those communications pieces comes down to the importance of using acceptable pesticides only. Those are pesticides which are registered for the crop to which they're being applied and which will not create trade concerns in relevant export markets. There's many ways that this can be done, but first and foremost, we advise growers to always be in consultation with their grain buyer, making sure that if product is intended to be sold to a certain buyer, to a certain export market, that the way that they're treating the crop, that the tools that they're using are going to be acceptable to that end use buyer, both domestic and export customers. So you're gonna hear today a little bit about products of concern and changes that have happened over the growing season here. But really, first and foremost, it comes down to that open conversation, two ways of growers talking to their grain buyers and vice versa, to ensure that the information that they have is as most up to date as possible so that at the end of the day, there's no surprises on delivery. Next slide, please. So how do we determine market acceptance and use policy? Canada is maybe at the forefront of this in terms of our global competitors, and we've already touched on that reason. It's because we're so heavily export dependent. So industry, and in particular value chain associations, and back through the right down to the farm gate, have come through together and agreed to a voluntary policy because we need reliable access to our markets. And those markets vary based on what crop you are selling, based on what use you are selling it to. But the fundamental tenet there still remains that free and open access is going to be what helps us grow as a country, what helps us continue to drive exports. And we know that technologies are changing. So having the information for the latest crop protection products is very important at a farm level, at a grain handler level, seeing if any surprises are coming through. It's all about information sharing. So there's a steering group which gets together. There's a seat for every part of the value chain with our respective organizations, including national commodity organizations, growers, exporters, life science companies, retailers, consultation with government officials, just to ensure that what's being put together at what we would call an MRL assessment committee is going to help provide the most relevant information. Next slide, please. So what do the components of that look like? For each of our value chain organizations, when I mean that, I mean Cereals Canada, Canola Council, Pulse Canada. We each have a committee like this that is set up where assessments of new technologies or evaluations, if should a market issue arise, are brought to that table and discussed. And it's important to have a vast representation around there. So it's not a person out of an office in Winnipeg. It's not a grower themselves. It's the whole value chain coming together in direct consultation with the registrant, with grain handlers, with retailers, ensuring that everybody has access to the most relevant information, and seeing if there's a cross commodity approach. It may be headquartered or quarterbacked through something like the Canada Grains Council, of which we are all members. But it's very important that we have these kind of committees that get together on an annual basis or as needed if things change throughout the year to help determine risk when it comes to crop protection products. So as you can see on the next slide, there's kind of 3 steps that we take to determine market risk. Where are the key markets that we are exporting into? And are the MRLs or lack of MRLs in some instances there of concern? What are the products that are being looked at? Will residues actually be able to cause a trade problem? And what is the level of risk? We know that there are high volume crops, there are low volume crops. When we sit back and do the math, where should we be expending our efforts on and ensuring that trade can continue to flow? So on the next slide, we you can start at the top at a bit of a funnel approach and see what we can get down to around that table. A new or amended regulation comes to the table. There are various steps in the process, and I won't belabor them here for this group, but just to show that these are the steps being taken by each value chain organization in consultation with the broader industry to ensure that the output, which we're going to talk about as the product advisory, has accurate information, has very timely information, and we've done our due diligence to ensure that Canada, will continue to provide a safe and quality product, which is in line with the MRLs of our key export markets. On the next slide, kind of some highlights or acceptability of risks. And so I'm not going to read the slide to you, but these are the types of things that we are looking at, or the groups are looking at with respect to, how products are applied, what the actual pest pressures of any given season might look like. Are we expecting more of a product or less of a product to be used? Where are things shipped? How are they shipped? Where are they headed to? Are they headed to a market like Chris has touched on with high sensitivities? Are they headed to more markets which have maybe a lower sensitivity with that? All of those things are looked at when it comes to determining risk. And the output of that, if you can see on the next slide, is a product categorization. So the products that you're going to see in any product advisory, which we're going to talk about, are really the first 2, which is do not use and be informed. If there's no recommendation, you see that green check mark, we tend not to communicate on the products which there's no risk around, because we'd be communicating till the cows come home. This is really about highlighting the products for which growers and those who advise them should be aware that they should be informed where it could cause market risk, or they should not be using because there is an elevated or heightened risk of an MRL trade-related disruption, and they could cause real harm to Canada's export program. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Krista, who's going to touch on the product updates for cereals, and we'll talk about pulses a little later in the program.
Thanks, Jeff. Before I get into the existing advisories on cereals, I did want to highlight there are no new actives that have been added on the advisories this year for cereals, but we do have one change to share with you. So again, these decisions come out of the committee and the process that Jeff just outlined to you. Next slide, please. So I'm going to begin with our barley actives today, and that is also where we're seeing our cereals advisory changes for the 2026 growing season. So I'm starting with the fungicide tetraconazole today. So that would be a product like Roxar, which is an existing and unchanged advisory. So on the malt barley side of things, grain buyers will not accept malt barley that is treated with tetraconazole, and this is due to MRL marketing risks that have been identified in some key export markets. So in this case, you can see up on your screen, we have MRLs that are missing for Codex as well as for China. However, the advisory for fluopyrim on malt barley has changed slightly for the 2026 growing season. So when this advisory was put in place for fluopyrim on barley, it was put on for both malt as well as barley for food and feed. It was due to having several missing or low MRLs in our target export markets for Canadian barley. So since then, over the last few seasons, there have been MRLs established in major markets that were missing or low, most notably Japan. And we are down to the last remaining MRL that we would like to see for additional trade certainty. And I'm excited to say that this MRL has been proposed. So in anticipation of this MRL and the size of the market, the advisory on malt barley has changed from a red or a do not use, as you would have seen it last year, to an amber or a be informed this year. So the advice here is that malt barley growers should talk to their grain buyer to ensure that it will be accepted if it's treated with fluopyrim before using this fungicide. And again, this is a proposed MRL that we're working with right now. So when we think about the application timing of a barley fungicide, there is still some time for this MRL to be established within the growing season. And that is something we will use Keep It Clean to communicate as well through our other value chain channels like our grower associations. So really, again, the advice there is talk to your grain buyer before applying fluopyrim to malt barley because of this change that we're anticipating, because your grain buyer really has the best understanding of the end markets of your grain. Next slide, please. So for this one, chlormequat continues to pose a market access risk on barley due to MRL misalignments in export countries. So chlormequat was categorized as amber because we had misaligned MRLs in China, Codex, and the US. Oh, and also just for some additional clarity, chlormequat would be the active ingredient in manipulator. So previously, we've seen a little bit of movement here. So the Codex MRL for chlormequat was previously 2 parts per million, and as of December 2025, so the end of last year, the Codex MRL has been bumped up to 5 parts per million. So really, again, similar messaging for fluopyrim when you're looking at malt barley, and if you're wanting to use chlormequat, it's important to consult with your grain buyer before you use this product on your barley. As well, when we think about this, this is, a positive step towards being able to remove some of these advisories, and this is part of that annual work that Jeff was alluding to that we do as a value chain organization. When we look at saflufenicil, there is also continued potential marketing risk for malt barley treated with saflufenicil. However, this is due to negative effects on the malting process, but it is acceptable on the food and feed side of things. So to be clear, this is not an MRL related issue, as you can see on your screen, but it is more related to acceptance by malt companies. Next slide, please. Now we're going to move into barley for food and feed, which has also been updated. So that potential MRL marketing risk for barley treated with tetraconazole still exists for food and feed barley, since there is no change to this advisory. And then again, that potential MRL marketing risk that I outlined for barley treated with chlormequat, it's the same as for malt barley. And as I mentioned, that update to the Codex MRL, which is promising. So especially when we do have multiple MRLs that are low or missing, this is that kind of stepwise progress that's moving us in the right direction, and we'll continue to keep you updated on an annual basis. And the other update that I do want to provide on barley for food and feed would be for the 2026 growing season compared to last year. You will notice that we have removed the advisory for fluopyrim. So this would be a product like Procero Pro. So this has been removed from the advisory on barley for food and feed. It was previously an amber or a B informed, so to have a conversation with your grain buyer because of those low MRLs in export markets. So considering your barley markets for feed and the proposed MRL, we were able to change this advisory for this year. Next slide, please. And we can cover glyphosate on cereals as well. Notable that there are no changes to this category. We're looking at a red or a do not use on malt barley, as malt buyers will not accept grain that is treated with pre-harvest glyphosate. For other cereals, so this would be barley for food and feed, wheat, and for oats, it's important to check in with your grain buyer if they have any restrictions on the use of pre-harvest glyphosate in markets that they're shipping to. So for this one, it remains as an amber or be informed. And these advisories are all related to market acceptance and not to the MRLs themselves. So we do have MRLs established for glyphosate in our export markets, and we meet those domestic and export market MRLs. Next slide, please. So to shift gears a little bit out of our pure advisories that we're sharing for this year, just a couple of other reminders for your growing season and even later into the growing season as we think past seeding and spraying on desiccants. So really, it's essential to distinguish between desiccation and pre-harvest weed control. Using the wrong product can really lead to residue levels that exceed those international limits, those MRLs that we've been talking about. And it's really important to remember, using products which are registered at desiccants to dry out that green material as they're intended. But really, one of the big messages here is to avoid non-registered products. So while we have products on the market like Diquat or glufosinate ammonium that can be applied to other crops, these are not registered for use on wheat or barley or oats. And their use can lead to these, zero tolerance type of residue detections in export markets. The bottom line here is that if they're not labeled for those crops, we often don't have MRLs or we don't have the appropriate MRLs in place to be thinking about those. And further to that point, also, desiccants have that later season application timing where we can see increased risks of residues, especially when they're not expected if the product isn't registered. And then the final point to make just would be around glyphosate. So that reminder with the distinction of glyphosate that it is a systemic herbicide for perennial weed control, not a desiccant. And so it should only be applied according to label directions. And again, in fact, we can have some issues if we don't follow that timing as well. So the reminder to follow the label on those products. Next slide, please. So really, when we think about following the label, applying that product off label is a really quick way to jeopardize a shipment. So label rates are calibrated to ensure that the product performs, but also it keeps those residues in check to the safe levels for trade that we've been talking about when your grain reaches the elevator. So through the Keep It Clean program, we really want to remind growers to follow the rate. So applying above that label rate can increase the risk of detectable residues. We want to follow the timing. So applying crop protection products only at the recommended stage. And then also that pre-harvest interval. So really that minimum time between spraying and harvesting a crop, we don't want to be cutting that early and we don't want to be applying certain products too early either. Next slide, please. And finally, I want to talk to you briefly about allergens, and this is part of our Deliver What You Declare campaign. So again, something to think about down the road, but to prepare for now. If we do have contamination of shipments, this can lead to rejections, recalls, and also damage to the market confidence in Canada. And this can be especially true when we consider the unintentional mingling of allergenic grains with cereals in particular. So other crop types, they would include mustard, soy, and buckwheat. They can be allergen sources in our export markets. And having the unintentional mingling of these allergenic grains with our cereal crops can really pose a significant risk to consumer health and also to our market access. To mitigate these allergy risks, often export markets have stringent limits. So buckwheat in particular is a highly allergenic crop that, if mixed with cereals, can trigger severe reactions in sensitized individuals. So its presence can also lead to those trade implications that we are worried about. So really, when we think about things like buckwheat, soy, mustard, think of it similar to a peanut allergy in North America and how seriously we take that. So with that, I'm going to close out for cereals, and for advisories on Pulse next. Jeff, I'm going to pass it back to you.
Thanks, Krista. We'll jump into the Pulse advisory here on the next slide. Probably the biggest thing to note is that they're similar to cereals. There's been no new actives introduced, no new really things to flag, but I do want to touch on some of the changes from last year that we're still going to be reiterating this year, namely the advisory on flinicamid when used on green lentils, as well as our continued efforts on glufosinate ammonium with respect to its use in pulse crops. So we'll get into the crop type by crop type advisory here. So if you see on the next slide, with respect to dry beans, no new information or no changes over the previous year. Glyphosate, always a market acceptance notation next to that one with respect to dry beans. Most dry bean dealers do not allow pre-harvest glyphosate in terms of that. It's always very important to talk to that grain buyer to ensure that what you are doing on beans is going to be used acceptable to the end use buyer. With respect to glufosinate, which are the big glyphosate, glufosinate, which are the big two that we would typically call out. In Eastern Canada, there is some registration on certain crops, bean crops, which would be destined for certain markets like Japan. These are very one-off instances. And so the general assumption that we advise is that to not use the product. Again, talk to your grain buyer if you think that applies to you. They will be communicative on that. With respect to Western Canada, there is no registered use, and so it is do not use. On the next slide, we'll touch on chickpeas. So glyphosate, again, be informed. There's a market acceptance notation. It's more around market acceptance than it is around MRL concerns. We're seeing time and time again, certain buyers demanding certain things, and so your grain buyer would know, would be closest to that set of information. With respect to glufosinate as well, it is not registered for use on chickpeas and therefore is do not use. Grain buyers have been clear they will not accept pulse crops treated, any pulse crop treated with glufosinate, and chickpeas would apply under that as well. On the next slide, we'll talk about faba beans. So faba's same information as the previous two, the market acceptance with respect to glyphosate and the do not use for glufosinate. These are not, again, not new classifications, but one that we do want to continue to communicate, back through to growers, through to advisors, just so everybody has the same information, helping us protect those markets for faba beans. On the next slide, with lentils, as I mentioned, when opening this section of the program, the flinicamid last year, there had been some uncertainty with MRLs in the European Union, specifically with respect to green lentils. So we've worked very closely as a value chain association with the registrant, with the distributor to address some of this uncertainty and to find out what exactly the end use market is requiring. Therefore, we do have a classification of being informed. We are recommending that folks talk to their grain buyers with respect to green lentils, green specifically, and the use of this product, flinicamid. You can think of carbine would be the one that comes to mind. That treated green lentils may not be accepted by some buyers, and that is obviously something to know before that product is applied. Glyphosate on lentils, again, a market acceptance notation used to indicate when there's a market risk. Always depending on the market, depending on the timing. Use of pre-harvest glyphosate is restricted on some crops by some grain buyers, and so having that conversation with your grain buyer is very important. And then with respect to glufosinate, there is no MRLs established in our key markets that we see it for this type of use on product. So grain buyers are not accepting pulses treated with glufosinate, and that includes lentils. That maintains for the 2026 season. Moving on to peas, glyphosate again. Be informed of the market risk, market acceptance risk when it comes to peas. I hate to sound like a broken record, but it's restricted on crops by some grain buyers. So again, it comes down to that conversation. We'll say it over and over and over. Just being informed about what your grain buyer or grain buyers are looking or will accept. Glufosinate, again, it's not registered for use on peas. It is not to be used on any pulse crop, and will cause us harm in the global market, both the Canadian as well as the global market. And so it is being treated as a do not use. And with that, I think I'll pass it off to Curtis Rempel from the Canola Council, who will provide updates on canola.
Thanks, Jeff. Yep, next slide, please. So with respect to products, with respect to new active ingredients and new uses for actives, there are no currently, like the other two crops, no new actives or no new uses for this current coming crop production year. And the product label and the guidelines reflect the current market access guidelines accurately. Next slide. With respect to product applications, product application rate, timing, etc. This has been already highlighted or discussed at length, but it bears repeating, especially with pre-harvest, applying pre-harvest applications to follow the product label rate carefully, to follow crop timing and application timing and crop staging recommendations accurately, and to stick to the product label pre-harvest intervals. And the pre-harvest interval, as stated here, is the number of days between spraying and cutting your crop by swathing or straight combining or straight cutting. Next slide. With respect to timing for glyphosate for pre-harvest, specifically for canola, we're looking for the canola grain moisture content to be less than 30%. When you're assessing this, you're looking for the least mature areas of your field. So typically low spots, areas that have maybe had slightly higher density for seeding rates, etc. Applications made too early increase the risk of unacceptable residues in the grain. With respect to the pre-harvest interval for canola, it is 7 to 14 days. And you can refer to the Keep It Clean tools at the website indicated with respect to staging canola cereals and pulses. Very quickly for canola, staging canola for 30%, you're looking to 50 to 60% seed color change. That's very easy to determine. You go to the main raceme of the plant, the top third, the seeds are going to be green, but they're going to be firm. You shouldn't be able to crush them. You should be able to roll them in your hand. The middle third of the main raceme, the seed color will start changing. You'll see brown and black, but you'll also see flecks of green in the seed. And on the bottom third, you're going to see the seeds will be completely brown or black. Next slide. In terms of application staging, you can see on the slide that there are some products that have fairly long or lengthy application windows. But in our case, with Keep It Clean and indeed with all good agronomy practices, we're looking for integrated pest management practices to apply. And so in this case, just because you have a longer application window doesn't mean that you should. And if you look at many of our products for maximizing yield of canola and maximizing canola quality as well, and for maximum efficacy for the product and also to reduce cost, typically applications early, especially for weed control, really give you benefits both for control, for yield, and for cost control. And there's a myriad of well documented peer-reviewed publications that show that early pest control pays significant dividends, and it also does. It's another way of ensuring that you keep your crop clean. Next slide, please. Again, we've talked about this at length, but again, the reminder: the pre-harvest intervals can vary greatly between products, and for example, we've talked about glyphosate, but if you look at and you use the use calculator that's highlighted on the keepitclean.ca /tools, you'll find an excellent calculator for all of the different crop kinds. If you bring up glufosinate, for instance, in canola, you'll see that you have a pre-harvest interval of 60 days. So this tool is excellent. It allows you, it provides you a quick guide for pre-harvest interval, and then you can use the product label for further clarification. And it's, as we've already discussed, it's critical to follow these pre-harvest intervals in order to keep the crop clean and allow for optimum marketing of all of our crops in Canada. Next slide. With respect to drones, drone technology is advancing quickly. All of you are probably aware of that. Currently, Health Canada has not yet approved application of pesticides with drones. We expect this to become the approvals to be coming probably later this year, but currently drone application would be an off-label application. It's also our understanding that when we do have regulatory approval for application of pesticides with drones, that the aerial label is going to apply. So if the product does not have an aerial label, it will not be labeled or registered for application with a drone. And I think that's self-explanatory, but it probably bears keeping in mind. Next slide. Also, with respect to Keep It Clean, we do have we have two diseases in particular. One is a trade irritant. Blackleg in canola is a trade irritant. And Fusarium head blight also has trade or guidelines for management due to presence of vomit toxin. With respect to canola and blackleg as a trade irritant, we do have excellent guidelines for managing blackleg within your crop. Crop rotation is one of your number one tools to manage the disease. We do know that most of the inoculum comes from second-year stubble, so growing canola every 3 years on a piece of land is one way to significantly reduce inoculum pressure. Another excellent way is to plant resistant varieties. All of our current registered canola varieties have excellent blackleg resistance. There's multiple different genes available within these varieties, and an excellent tool is to use the different genes in rotation in your fields as well. And then another thing to consider is to plant clean seed. The seed treatments themselves can be effective, and fungicides can be effective. In the case of canola, you have to apply very early, probably 1 to 2 leaf stage. Later than that, they are not efficacious, and that's backed up by research. And if you also look at the Keep It Clean website, you can find excellent prediction maps for predicting and managing Fusarium head blight. Next slide. And lastly, we also have to focus in terms of keep it clean on proper storage. Clean your bins before storing your crop. Use only approved bin treatments, for example, diatomaceous earth and cereals. Never use malathion to prepare canola for storage or treat bins used to store canola. Malathion is in bin storage is off-label. And then keep your bins cool and dry and check and well ventilated, and check the crop condition regularly. Next slide, please. And finally, in terms of a variety declaration, many grain buyers now are looking for a declaration of eligibility for delivery of grain with respect to a variety that is eligible for its kind or class, if applicable in Canada, and also with respect to canola, that the variety, canola at least, that the variety is registered for use in Canada. Your grain buyer may also ask you to sign a commercial declaration that indicates your crop was not treated with specific crop input products to ensure it meets the requirements of our export markets, as been highlighted by our two panelists already. If you are in doubt about the status of a canola variety with respect to registration, the CFIA maintains a website that lists all of our registered varieties. And they also do list deregistered varieties, but you can contact us at the Canola Council of Canada if you have any questions as well. Next slide. And the last but not least, all of the items that we've been discussing today on the call, you can find all of the references and product guidelines, staging guidelines, etc., an excellent suite of tools at our keepitclean.ca website. Next slide.
Great, thanks, Curtis. We'll move into the Q&A portion of the webinar. We do have a few minutes for any questions. If you have any questions, feel free to put them into the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Maybe I will just start with a couple of them here. Krista, I'm going to turn this one to you. In the EU, how do you handle pesticides they are banning, and what does this mean for Canadian growers?
Thanks, Heidi, and thank you for the question from our audience. I think when we think about the EU, it's a bit twofold right now. So as I mentioned, we are doing a lot of monitoring of the policy direction they're going there, because definitely we have concerns if pesticides are being banned in the EU, and this omnibus proposal would move forward, that that could potentially put some products in jeopardy for if we're able to use them. But maybe more on the process or technical side, Jeff talked through, how we use our committees and MRL assessment. And that's something we also do on an annual basis or more often if needed for those changes. So each of our commodity organizations is constantly monitoring changes in markets, including the EU. So when those pesticides are banned in the EU, we are looking at if that changes the MRL. Some of them, it drives them down. Some of them are able to be maintained. And we do a lot of monitoring with respect to how those compare to Canadian MRLs, and we connect with registrants if necessary on, what kind of risk that might pose. And if it would produce a risk, it's something that might be added to keep it clean, or there might be some of those kind of intermediary advocacy activities to be able to communicate that to the value chain if it would have an immediate impact on growers.
Great, thanks, Krista. Another question here, how can marketing risks still be present if MRLs are established in a market? Jeff, maybe I'll turn this one over to you.
Yeah, I mean, it comes down to ultimately what the end customer is asking for. And so just because an MRL has been established, certain companies out there have certain market positions or plays. We see it a lot with respect to the use of, say, glyphosate, where it's not necessarily around the MRL, but it is specific companies or who feel that their consumers are asking for this. And so, the last thing that we want at the end of the day is for someone to have followed all the rules and done it to the letter of the rules, and then find out there's an extra step or extra barrier to the acceptance of that product, which is why you see some of those market access notations in the product advisory, just for full awareness so that growers, right through to the end user have the information that they need to know that when they go to sell that product, the products applied will be accepted at the end use. And so it's not necessarily MRLs are part of the story, but the market acceptance is becoming a larger and larger piece and largely consumer and company driven.
Great. Thanks, Jeff. Curtis, a canola specific question here for you. So you talked about, having canola at the right time for pre-harvest glyphosate application. So what do I do if my canola is very stagey, different stages? What do you advise for determining that right application timing?
Yeah, great question, Heidi. This recommendation is different than almost all of the other recommendations where you're looking at making a composite across the field. Here you are focusing on those areas that are the least mature, the last to mature to make your assessment. And so that might be looking at the last 10% of your field, and that'll be your guidance for a correct application.
Great. Thanks, Curtis. Yeah, so if we didn't get to your question today, or if something else comes up over the next couple of days, just feel free to email us again, info@keepitclean.ca. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I guess that brings us to the end of today's webinar. I'll just wrap up with a few final notes. So as you exit the webinar, please just take a minute or two to complete a Zoom feedback survey that'll pop up on your screen. We really appreciate your feedback as we look forward to planning more webinars. We'll also be posting the webinar to our Keep It Clean website, and we'll email a link to the webinar recording next week. You're welcome to share the recording and any of those resources within your networks. And finally, for those interested in receiving the CEUs for participating in today's webinar, we will be submitting a list of the CCAs who attended today's live session, along with the CCA numbers that we collected at registration. And if you missed providing your CCA number, just please email us at info@keepitclean.ca, and we'll make sure that we add you to the list. On behalf of Keep It Clean, thanks again for everyone for joining us today. Thank you to our speakers for sharing their time and expertise, and I hope everyone has a great afternoon. Thanks again.
Thank you.